For over 1,000 years, an incredibly wealthy empire stood right at the literal crossroads of Europe and Asia. Its capital was just this sprawling metropolis. We're talking air thick with exotic spices, magnificent churches covered in gleaming gold mosaics, and brilliant scholars who carefully preserved ancient Greek and Roman knowledge while much of the rest of Europe was, well, plunging into the Dark Ages. Their armies fought off Persians, Arabs, Crusaders, and Turks, fiercely defending a heavily fortified city that connected the Mediterranean directly to the Black Sea. Now, when most of us hear the word Byzantine, we kind of picture this mysterious, glittering civilization that just floated somewhere between the Roman Empire and the Middle Ages, almost like a historical ghost. Well, let's dive right into this explainer, because I want to prepare you for a massive historical plot twist right out of the gate. So here is the really strange truth. The Byzantine Empire never ever called itself that. The term Byzantine was completely made up by modern historians way after the empire had already fallen. It was just a convenient way for them to distinguish this medieval, Greek-speaking state from the classical, Latin-speaking Roman Empire of antiquity. But the people actually living in it, they firmly call themselves Romans, or in their native Greek, Romeoioi. To them, their emperor was the Roman emperor, and he ruled from the New Rome. For centuries, they absolutely believed they were the direct, unbroken continuation of the Roman Empire, not some brand new medieval startup state. They didn't see a collapse, they just saw a continuation.
Part 1. Surviving the Dark Ages, a centralized state.
Okay, so this begs a pretty massive question. How exactly did the Roman Empire manage to survive for another 1,000 years after its famous western half completely collapsed into a bunch of scattered kingdoms? To really get this, we need to look at the timeline. By the 4th century, the Roman Empire was just enormous. It stretched all the way from the rainy moors of Britain, across Europe, North Africa, and deep into the Middle East. It was simply too vast to control from one single point. So in 330 AD, Emperor Constantine makes a brilliant strategic pivot. He recognized where the real wealth and population were, in the eastern provinces. So he established a new, heavily fortified capital in the ancient Greek city of Byzantium and renamed it Constantinople. It was perfectly positioned to control absolutely critical trade routes. Later, as pressures mounted, like severe economic stagnation, civil wars, and massive migrations of Germanic peoples pushing across the borders, the empire's administration was officially divided into west and east to just try and keep it manageable. And then we hit the critical moment. 476 AD. The Western Roman emperor gets deposed. The traditional Rome of the Caesars essentially collapses under the weight of invasions and economic ruin. But the East? The East survives.
While the West was fragmenting and dissolving into rural fiefdoms, the East held the line, and they did it by relying on a few core pillars. First off, they had incredibly wealthy cities like Alexandria and Antioch that acted as massive economic engines for trade. They also kept a really powerful, highly educated bureaucracy running. Unlike the West, where the infrastructure just crumbled, the East kept a functioning tax system. They were actually collecting revenue in gold, which meant they could afford to fund a professional standing army and a massive naval fleet. But above all else, they had Constantinople. This was a virtually impregnable capital guarded by water on 3 sides and gigantic stone walls on the other. They remained a highly centralized, stable state while the rest of the world was plunging into chaos. Sure, over time, Greek replaced Latin as the everyday language and Orthodox Christianity became central to who they were, but to the everyday citizens walking those streets, they were still Romans, holding back the dark.
Part 2. Golden Age and Grinder, Justinian's reign.
That incredible survival really sets the stage for our next chapter. We're moving into the 6th century now, which was completely dominated by this highly ambitious, super restless ruler named Emperor Justinian. His reign brought some magnificent glory to the empire, but it also brought it right to the absolute brink of total destruction. You see, Justinian was a guy who dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire to its former massive borders. He absolutely refused to accept that the West was gone forever. So he launches these wild, incredibly expensive military campaigns across the Mediterranean. Under his top general, Belisarius, Byzantine armies actually managed to conquer North Africa back from the Vandals. They brutally invaded Italy to rip it away from the Ostrogoths and even took back parts of the Iberian Peninsula. For a brief shining moment, it really looked like the old Roman world was back together. But beyond the battlefield, Justinian did something that directly impacts you and me today. He ordered a massive project to systematically collect, edit, and organize centuries of chaotic Roman laws into one single unified code, the Corpus Juris Civilis. This one legal code would go on to shape European legal traditions for centuries and literally laid the foundation for modern civil law across the globe. But man, these grand ambitions came at a steep price. The wars in Italy dragged on forever, devastating the countryside, ruining the city of Rome itself, and practically draining the imperial treasury down to its last gold coin.
So you've got the immense financial strain of these endless wars, plus crushing taxes at home. It created a total pressure cooker.
In 532 AD, it finally blew up in what's called the Nika Revolt. Now, this wasn't just a simple street protest. It actually started at the Hippodrome, which was this massive chariot racing stadium between rival sports fan factions known as the Blues and the Greens. But it very quickly escalated into intense, city-consuming political violence aimed directly at Justinian. Much of Constantinople was literally set on fire. Buildings were utterly destroyed, and an angry mob was actively demanding a brand new emperor. It got so terrifying that Justinian actually had his bags packed and was ready to flee his own capital by ship. But his wife, Empress Theodora, steps in. She famously intervenes, basically telling him she would rather die wearing the imperial purple than flee into exile like a coward. Emboldened by her, Justinian chooses to stay. He orders his generals back into the stadium, and the revolt is brutally, systematically crushed. They left something like 30,000 rioters dead right there in the streets.
So stepping out of the smoldering ashes of that terrifying revolt, Justinian knew he needed to make an absolute statement. He needed to project his divine right to rule. So he orders the construction of what would become one of the most famous, breathtaking buildings in human history, the Hagia Sophia. He poured staggering amounts of wealth into this project and remarkably got it finished in just under 6 years. It was a gigantic church crowned by an enormous dome that looked like it was just magically floating in the air. It pushed the absolute limits of ancient engineering. For centuries, this architectural marvel stood as the ultimate symbol of Byzantine power, wealth, and spiritual dominance. I mean, when foreign diplomats or Viking mercenaries walked into the Hagia Sophia, they were literally struck speechless by the shimmering gold mosaics and just the sheer cavernous scale of the place. It was a clear message cast in stone, marble, and gold. The emperor is chosen by God, and this empire is not going anywhere.
Part 3. Secrets of Survival. Outlasting enemies.
But obviously, the empire couldn't just rely on grand buildings to keep them safe. They were constantly facing a relentless grinder of enemies from every single direction. Most notably, jumping to the 7th century, newly unified Arab Muslim armies started expanding incredibly fast out of the Arabian Peninsula. They ended up conquering extremely rich Byzantine territories in Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa. The empire shrank dramatically. They were quite literally fighting for their lives. And yet, Constantinople held firm against massive, repeated sieges. So how did they repel these overwhelming waves of enemies? Well, first was their engineering. They had the legendary Theodosian walls, a triple-layered defensive line on land, and a massive iron chain they'd hoist across the water to block enemy ships from entering their harbor. But then they had their absolute trump card, Greek fire. To this day, the exact chemical formula is a closely guarded mystery lost to history. But it was this highly classified incendiary weapon pumped through bronze tubes on their naval ships, and it literally burned on water. Actually, throwing water on it usually made the flames spread faster. Imagine being an attacking sailor packed onto a wooden ship, and suddenly a stream of liquid, clinging fire sweeps over your fleet, incinerating everything it touches. To their enemies, Greek fire appeared almost supernatural. It was a terrifying weapon that saved the capital time and time again.
But they didn't just rely on brute force and terrifying fire weapons to endure. The Byzantines were absolute political masterminds. Knowing they were surrounded by hostile forces, they developed a highly sophisticated system of diplomacy to just outlast their foes. Sometimes they'd use marriage alliances, sending imperial princesses off to foreign courts. Other times, they just paid direct tribute. I mean, literally shipping cartloads of gold to buy off a threat, because they calculated it was way cheaper to just pay off a warlord than to fight a 10-year war against them. They'd also use religious influence, actively working to convert foreign powers to their side to wrap them up in Byzantine cultural gravity. And when none of that worked, pure political manipulation. They ran a super robust intelligence network and would carefully figure out ways to incite their rival enemies to fight each other. So if a northern tribe was gearing up to attack Constantinople, the Byzantines would quietly send gold and weapons to a different tribe even further north to attack the first guys from behind. It was one of the most sophisticated, calculating political systems of the medieval world, and it allowed them to punch way above their actual military weight.
Internally, though, things were starting to fracture, especially with their former allies in the West. Religion was absolutely central to Byzantine life, but deep theological and political disputes kept growing between the Greek-speaking East and the Latin-speaking West. And this wasn't just about minor differences in how they performed church rituals. It was a massive power struggle. The Pope in Rome claimed universal authority over the entire Christian church, but the Patriarch of Constantinople, who was heavily backed by the Byzantine Emperor, saw the church leadership more as a council of equals. This friction, combined with centuries of cultural drift and totally different geopolitical priorities, finally boiled over in 1054 AD with what we call the Great Schism. The representatives of the Pope and the Patriarch literally mutually excommunicated each other. This was a massive event that permanently divided Christianity into Roman Catholicism in the West and Eastern Orthodoxy in the East. From then on, Byzantium became the undisputed cultural and spiritual heart of Orthodox Christianity. They sent brilliant missionaries deep into Slavic lands, which eventually led to the conversion of rulers like Vladimir of Kiev. That single event deeply anchored the entire future of Russia and Eastern Europe to Byzantine culture, art, and religion.
Part 4. The Fall of Constantinople, the Final Siege.
Despite all that immense cultural power, their geopolitical reality was deteriorating fast. Their enemies were multiplying, and a long, agonizing decline had definitely begun. A huge turning point was a catastrophic defeat by the rapidly expanding Seljuk Turks at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. That battle cost the Byzantines control of their agricultural heartland and their primary military recruiting ground in Anatolia. Desperate and bleeding territory, the Byzantine Emperor formally asked Western Europe for some mercenary help, but what they got instead were the Crusades, these massive, totally uncontrollable armies just marching right through their territory. And that leads us to arguably the most devastating year in Byzantine history, 1204, the Fourth Crusade. Initially, the emperors hoped these Western armies would help them recover lost land, but there was so much deep mistrust, lingering resentment from the Great Schism, and intense political friction that it just exploded. In 1204, in a shocking, brutal betrayal, these Western European Christian armies didn't march off to fight Muslim powers in the Holy Land. Instead, they turned their weapons right on their hosts. They attacked, breached the walls, and brutally sacked Constantinople. They looted centuries of ancient art, smashed golden altars, and set fire to grand libraries. For the Byzantines, having their capital shattered and occupied by fellow Christians was just an unimaginable, heartbreaking disaster. The empire fractured, and the imperial court was forced to flee into exile, setting up small, scrappy successor states out in the countryside.
Now, the empire did eventually manage to claw its way back. They miraculously recovered the city in 1261. But the brutal truth here is that the Byzantine state was permanently crippled by that betrayal. The economy was completely shattered, their vital trade routes had been totally taken over by Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa, and their territory dramatically reduced to just the area immediately around the capital and parts of Greece. They were truly just a shadow of their former glory. Worse still, they found themselves completely surrounded by rapidly expanding Turkish forces, eventually led by the Ottomans, who were just gobbling up every single remaining scrap of Byzantine territory in Anatolia and the Balkans. And because of all those political and religious divisions with Western Europe, despite desperate pleas from the very last emperors, no meaningful military support was ever going to arrive to save them. They were entirely on their own.
Which brings us to the final, heavy impact, the year 1453. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, was brilliant, highly ambitious, and utterly determined to take Constantinople once and for all to make it the jewel of his own empire. The Byzantines were vastly outnumbered. We're talking maybe 7,000 or 8,000 defenders holding out against an Ottoman army of over 80,000. But even more importantly, the technological balance of the world had fundamentally shifted. Mehmed didn't just bring men, he brought overwhelming, terrifying military technology. The Ottomans deployed these enormous, custom-cast bronze siege cannons. These massive guns fired stone balls heavy enough to literally shake the earth, and they systematically blasted apart the famous ancient Theodosian walls, the same walls that had protected the city for over 1,000 years. For weeks, the city endured a relentless, deafening bombardment. Finally, on the morning of May 29, 1453, Ottoman forces breached the defenses. The fighting poured right into the streets. The last Roman emperor, Constantine XI, realizing the city was lost, stripped off his imperial regalia, drew his sword, and disappeared into the chaotic fray, fighting to the death alongside his remaining men. After a remarkable run of nearly 1,500 years since Augustus Caesar, the physical Roman Empire was finally, truly gone.
Part 5. A legacy that survived. Echoes of Rome.
More than 1,000 years after Constantine the Great originally founded the city, the Roman Empire in the East had ended. The magnificent city of Constantinople was transformed into the vibrant center of the Ottoman Empire, eventually becoming modern-day Istanbul, and that towering Hagia Sophia was converted into a grand mosque. But as we look at their massive hidden legacy, it is absolutely vital to realize that while the physical walls fell, their cultural and political footprint never truly vanished. All those Byzantine scholars, monks, and intellectuals who fled the falling empire, they carried priceless ancient Greek and Roman manuscripts with them straight to Italy. This directly contributed to the rediscovery of classical knowledge. This massive influx of ancient thought
acted as a huge catalyst, helping to trigger the European Renaissance, which fundamentally changed the entire course of Western history. On top of that, Byzantine art, those mesmerizing icons, and their profound theology formed the absolute foundation of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, a faith that is still passionately practiced by hundreds of millions of people today. Their unique architectural styles, featuring those grand central domes, completely shaped the skylines of churches across all of Eastern Europe and Russia. And remember Justinian's corpus juris civilis? That systematic organization of laws heavily influenced the civil legal codes that governments all across the globe still rely on today. So much of our present reality, our laws, our art, our history, is built directly upon Byzantine survival.
I want to end today's explainer with a provocative thought to leave you pondering. We are all taught in school that the Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, right? That is the established narrative. But did it? Or did it just adapt to a changing world, transform its dominant language from Latin over to Greek, shift its center of gravity, and survive in the East for another 1,000 years? The truth is, the Roman eagle continued to fly over the heavily fortified walls of Constantinople right up until those cannons roared in 1453. It totally challenges everything we think we know about the timeline of medieval history, doesn't it? It's a fascinating reframe of the human past. It's a story of incredible resilience, brilliant diplomacy, and enduring legacy. I really hope this journey leaves you wanting to dig even deeper into one of history's longest, most complex, and honestly most incredible chapters.